Let's talk a little more about input. Hello and welcome. Welcome to Input English. In this episode, I'd like to do a little deeper dive into input and hopefully give you a little perspective that you'll find interesting and useful. As you know, I make content which is intended specifically for people learning English to watch and listen so that they can improve their listening comprehension and eventually their speaking ability using comprehensible input. We get this term of art from the work of Krashen, and it's now widely used in language learning circles. It is arguably the best way to learn language. On this channel, we put a lot of emphasis on watching videos and listening to content because listening content could be videos, could be podcasts, or it could be audiobooks. Indeed, it also could be language exchange that you would set up through an app such as Tandem. The reason I put a great deal of emphasis on listening to input is because that is important for the development of good pronunciation, and it's particularly important in the early stages of the language acquisition. I have not put a great deal of emphasis on reading input, although that is going to evolve in future videos. We will have a lot of content talking specifically about reading. I do have a video that showcases The Little Prince as a way of getting input by reading. To give you a little perspective on input, this is not an approach to learning that is exclusively used in language learning. We should not think for a moment that input was a new learning method established in the 1970s and that prior to that, input was simply not done. No, that is not the case at all. A couple of examples. 1, medical education. For hundreds and more likely thousands of years, medical education has been based on case studies. When students and young doctors are learning about disease and treatment, they are taught through stories the natural history, the symptoms, and the response to treatment. Comprehensible input as a way of gathering knowledge in medicine is the mainstay of medical education to this day. This does not detract from the didactic learning and the factual learning that is required. I'm simply pointing out for a young physician to develop skills in clinical medicine, stories are heavily relied upon to input that information. In law school, case studies are also heavily emphasized. During the first 2 years in most law schools, it is necessary for the student to analyze the law against the facts of different cases. It is not enough to memorize the law. The student needs to also learn the skill of applying the law to fact patterns. So case studies are an important part of legal education to this day. In my own educational experience, I was always torn between the need to make notes versus the need to listen clearly. Early on in my educational experience, I realized that taking notes during a lecture really puts the student at cross purposes because you really can listen much better if you're not writing and organizing and editing notes at the same time. For my money, taking notes during a lecture is the equivalent of watching television during the lecture. It distracts you from the story. I recognize that in some settings it is absolutely necessary to take notes during lectures. However, I tried to listen primarily to the lectures and avoided being distracted whenever possible. When we were children, there was a phenomenon that I don't see much at all anymore, and that is the traveling salesman. People would drive to the house, stop, get out of the car, and knock on the front door, hoping to get entry into the house, to be invited in so that they could present their wares. They wanted to sell us something. We don't see much in the way of traveling salesmen anymore, but when I was a kid, they were common. One of the traveling salesmen who came to the house when I was a young kid was selling encyclopedias. Luckily for him, my parents had been discussing their wish to foster our development and to provide resources in the house. They wanted an encyclopedia. In those days, there were two major encyclopedias. There was the more didactic and formal Encyclopedia Britannica. It was very well respected. It was bought by schools, and as analyzed by a preteen or young teenager, it was boring because it didn't have many pictures. In contrast, the World Book Encyclopedia seemed to have a fresher approach, and it was much quicker to catch the eye of young students. Luckily for me, my parents chose the World Book Encyclopedia. They purchased it and installed it in the family room. They made a bunch of rules. The rules made a great deal of sense even to the kids. Before you open up one of the encyclopedia volumes, wash your hands. Don't eat food while you're looking at the encyclopedia. Don't write or mark in the encyclopedia. Don't cut anything out. Don't damage the pages. Put the book back in the proper position on the bookshelf. It's alphabetical. The kids bought into all those rules, and I cannot recall anyone violating it. I don't know what my parents were thinking about the use of the encyclopedia. The way it was presented to them, this would be a good resource when the young student needed to write a report for school or look up something for school. In other words, it would be a reference for schoolwork. It's logical, isn't it? Sure. That isn't the way it worked. At least that's not the way it worked for me. The way it worked for me is I started with the S volume. S because it had science. It had a lot of science. At least that was my perception. And I read the S volume. I didn't read it in order, one page after another. I just pored over it and devoured it, and I quit reading the S volume when every page I looked at was familiar. I liked the S volume, and so I tried another volume. I recall not which one, but over a period of years, and who knows how many thousands of hours, I read the entire World Book Encyclopedia. It was my go-to instead of watching television. Now, that's not to say that I didn't watch television. I just preferred to read the World Book as compared to most of the television shows that were available. Reading the encyclopedia had an interesting effect that was not necessarily expected, certainly not by me. Bear in mind, I was reading the encyclopedia for entertainment. What happened over a period of years with that amount of input, my vocabulary got a lot bigger. It happened insidiously. It was not an abrupt change. It happened very gradually. And so nobody noticed the insidious change. And then in high school, the school system gave us all the pre-college aptitude tests that we needed to compete for positions in colleges. And we all took the tests. It was normal. I didn't even regard it as anything out of the ordinary. But when the results came back, all the teachers and I and my parents were astonished at what had occurred because I scored very high on those tests. Bear in mind, these tests tested us on our knowledge. And so they were testing a bunch of high school kids, and at least one of those kids read the World Book Encyclopedia. So I don't claim to be smart or special. No, I just got a bird's eye view of what happens when a high school kid reads an encyclopedia, perhaps out of boredom, but nonetheless read it. That input was fabulous. It had a huge impact on my vocabulary. It had a huge impact on my knowledge. And you could argue that it made my career because it made it easy to get into college. It made it easy to progress in the educational system. Needless to say, I am super grateful for my parents and their foresight having made that purchase for the family. That was not comprehensible input for the purpose of language learning, but it actually worked that way because I dramatically increased the size of my vocabulary. I learned words that I did not know. I learned words that my parents had not taught me, and I learned words that I did not learn in school. This is probably a good time to let you in on one of the special benefits of reading for you, reading for comprehensible input. Reading is arguably the best way to dramatically expand your vocabulary. We've already discussed that you don't want to memorize word lists and you don't want to look things up in the dictionary if you can avoid that. But if you read a variety of good quality written material in English, your vocabulary will soar. And bear in mind, when you're reading, you will be learning the words in context. It will be still by comprehensible input. Back in the 1960s, I did not know that I would be here talking to you on YouTube about comprehensible input. I did not know that my reading of the World Book Encyclopedia was best described as comprehensible input. I did not know that I was on a mission unintentionally to vastly expand my own vocabulary. But looking back, that's what happened. The reason I wanted to discuss input in these terms is I wanted to reassure you that input and learning from input is not a novel, new, avant-garde method of learning. No, it is mainstream human learning. It works, and it's worked for years. It's not a fad. So that's the end of this episode. I hope you enjoyed this little discussion. I invite comments below, and I hope you join us in future videos. See you soon.